Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. It's the final event in our series, Black Protest, Black Art, which examines the intersection of creative expression and the ongoing struggle for an equal and racially just world. Earlier programs focused on visual art and music. Tonight, we explore the written word. My name is Marcia Eli. I'm the Director of Programs at the Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History, and I'm a member of the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. We're really honored to be partnering in this series with New York University's Brooklyn-based 370J Project, the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music, and NYU's Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation. For the Center for Brooklyn History, tonight's conversation is part of a multifaceted initiative titled Brooklyn Resists, which explores the history and impact of Black-led protest. There's much to say about Brooklyn Resists, but I'll leave that for you to discover on your own. You can learn more about it at the link that will go into the chat. Tonight, writers Morgan Jerkins and Joshua Bennett join our series moderator, Jesse McCarthy. Before I turn it over to them, a few quick notes. First, I want to tell you that we are partnering with a local independent Brooklyn bookstore, community bookstore, where if you're interested, you can explore selected books by Morgan, Joshua, and Jesse. We'll place a link in the chat to those pages on the community bookstore's website. I also want to mention that closed captions are available tonight. Just click that live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I hope that you will all participate tonight. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A box throughout the program, and Jesse will take as many as he can towards the end of the conversation. So it has been a total joy to partner with our neighbors, NYU's Brooklyn-based 370J Project. It's my pleasure now to welcome 370J's Michael Bernard. Michael.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Before we begin, let me start by inviting you all to join me in acknowledging that while we may be gathered together virtually, we are all physically joining from locations throughout this city and perhaps the country that are on unceded homeland of, in New York, Lenape people, and other Native American peoples nationwide. And we pay our respects to these communities, their members past and present, as well as all future generations. New York University, Brooklyn Public Library, and the Center for Brooklyn History acknowledge that we were founded on and beneficiaries of the intentional exclusions, genocide, and erasure of the Lenape. We are committed to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies and repercussions of settler colonialism, and this acknowledgement is only the beginning of this effort. Now on to tonight's program. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the final program in this vital and illuminating series of conversations. My name is Michael Bernard, and I'm here representing the 370J Project, which is the programming arm of NYU's Brooklyn-based Center for Art, Technology, and Innovation at 370 J Street in downtown Brooklyn. I would like to extend my thanks once again to Marcia and her team at the Center for Brooklyn History for creating space for tonight's discussion and for assembling a remarkable panel of artists, writers, and thinkers for both this evening's discussion as well as the previous programs in this series. To start us off, I'd like to introduce one of these remarkable people, our moderator for tonight, Jesse McCarthy. Jesse is assistant professor in the Department of English and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Among his published works are a new introduction for the Norton Library edition of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, and an introduction for a new edition of Vincent O'Carter's The Burn Book. He is the author of the collection of essays, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, and a novel, The Fugitivities. Jesse, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you everyone for joining us again this evening. We're coming to the end of what has really been a really magnificent series. We've had an opportunity already to talk to artists working in the visual field. In the first iteration, I got the opportunity to talk to the photographer Ruddy Roy and the artist Dred Scott. In part two, we turned our attention to music And I was really blessed and fortunate to be able to talk to Jamila Woods and Jason King. Tonight, we're turning our attention to the word, written and otherwise, and thinking about Black literary tradition and its relationship to protests, to Black art and Black politics. And I'm extraordinarily blessed and fortunate to be joined this evening by two extraordinary writers who's already have extraordinarily accomplished careers that are really in a moment right now of great activity and flourishing. And I'm really excited to get to have this conversation with them and to round out this series with such wonderful interlocutors. And so I'll go ahead and introduce them now. First up, I have Morgan Jerkins, who is an essayist and novelist and writer. She is the New York Times bestselling author of the collection of essays, This Will Be My Undoing, Wandering in Strange Lands, and most recently, a novel entitled Call Baby, which I highly recommend. Please go get it. And we talked about the links in the chat. Morgan is the senior culture editor at ESPN's The Undefeated, and you can read her short form work in numerous places, including The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, Elle, Esquire, and The Guardian. I'm also very pleased to be joined by Joshua Bennett. Joshua is professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth. He's the author of 4 books of poetry and criticism. The Sobbing School, which was the winner of the National Poetry Series and a finalist for the NAACP Image Award, as well as his academic monograph, Being Property Once Myself, poetry collection Ode from 2020 here, and also The Study of Human Life. In 2021, he received a Guggenheim Fellowship in American Literature and a Whiting Award for poetry and nonfiction. Joshua and Morgan, it is an enormous pleasure, an honor to be joined by both of you this evening. Thanks so much for agreeing to do this.
Of course.
Of course, good to see you.
Very good to see you guys. So in all the conversations I've had, I like to start off talking a little bit actually about vocation. I always think, especially for folks in the audience, especially those folks who might be younger, who are, watching this and thinking about, how, excited they are to be readers of our work, others' work, but also aspiring creators and writers. Sometimes you look out and you see people doing things and you just kind of wonder, well, how did they get there? What was that path? How does that happen? How does someone go from being that young person who's inspired by books, who loves to read and write, to being someone who participates in the making of writing in the way that we do? I want to say a little bit, to include myself in this. And I said this before a little bit last time, but it's very true that I was originally a poetry guy. I was really a poetry nerd. Poetry was really my way in, the literary. It was really my first love in terms of literature. As folks who know, the title of my collection of essays, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, is actually a poem or song from Gil Scott-Heron. And I remember getting that album on CD and just playing it over and over and over again. And, that led me to, folks like Saul Williams and, this whole kind of tradition of spoken word that really connected with me. And I think helped me in a way kind of enter into a kind of wider world of literature. And though not necessarily, I think, really connecting with the novel as a form until I was really more in college. And then I remember very distinctly, I actually think it was my sophomore year, reading Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and just being so kind of taken with the way that his language kind of sounded on the page, and feeling like I'd never really encountered anything quite like that before. And it definitely, struck a chord, and I feel like it's sort of, these were kind of little things that kind of nudged and pushed me, further along and deeper into a world of reading and eventually writing also. But I wanted to begin with you guys, and if you could talk a little bit about both. On the one hand, were there any kind of events or people or moments in your life that you think you look back now and you think, yeah, that sort of put me on the path to becoming a writer, and also what kind of was the presence of literature in your life, and more generally even kind of the arts when you were young, not necessarily like a kid even, although it could be, but even just throughout your youth?
Mhm, mhm. Well, I think for me, I grew up in an artistic family.
Mm,
Um, my grandfather is the bishop of a church, so I was very used to seeing musicians who could
mhm.
learn by ear,
Yeah.
vocalists who could do all types of acrobatic runs on a typical Sunday morning. That was very normal for me. So I actually came through art generally through music.
Mhm.
But my two of my uncles are in the music industry, and I'll just brag on my mom for 2 seconds. So two of my uncles are in the
Go
music
ahead.
industry, and they actually produced Brandy's Never Say Never album. I didn't realize that my mother was a co-writer on one of those songs. Being created, I was so young. I'm in LA now, and I remember being in LA, and my mom was a writer. I didn't realize and she co-wrote a song on the album. And so I think that was probably my first bit of like, okay, you can combine music, you can have language with
Mhm.
sound and make it and take it to a whole new level. But even as a kid, like I was always invested in stories, but not through, I mean, I read books a lot, but
Mhm.
also I was just too huge on TV. Like my mom used to always say that you could put me in front of a TV and you wouldn't even know I'm in the room. So you can get a lot of work done because I talked a lot. So I was always trying to reimagine if I were to write something like this, how would I do it? So I always kept these little journals around. I would always create these like reenactments with my friend where I would write something and have them like act it
Mhm.
out on the bus to school. So I think
Mhm.
those were sort of the earliest iterations that I can think of.
Mm. That's beautiful. Thanks.
That's so scary. I feel like my story is sort of a fusion of both of yours in some way. And
Mhm.
it's funny because we're connected through Princeton, and Morgan, you just talked
That's
about
true.
TV. The reason I wanted to go to Princeton though is because Uncle Phil went there. So watching sort of the
Mm.
Fresh Prince of Bel-Air as a little
Mhm.
kid, watching, observing, listening, those were my ways into literary practice. Even my favorite novel as a college student was Song of Solomon. But when I
Mm.
look back, I realized it was also the first novel I ever physically saw. My big sister had a copy of it on her dresser, and I thought
Mm.
it was the Bible. It was sort of the old black hardcover with the kind of pink pages.
Yeah.
And so for me, my way into this world has always been through sort of sound and sight
Mhm.
and through the religious, right? So even coming into
Mhm.
spoken word, which is where I began as a poet,
Mhm.
was really through church. It was through seeing preachers, hearing them whoop and wail and not being really able to tell the difference between
Mhm.
when they were reading from the sermon notes and when they were just kind of
Mhm.
caught in the
Mhm.
flow of the spirit and kind of riding the organ and going back and forth with the crowd that had gathered, right, with the parishioners in the sanctuary. And so I wanted that power that I saw them tap into. And when I was a little boy, I would improvise sermons, and my whole family would gather around me in the living room. And I think that just taught me something about the stage and how mystical it was, that feeling. And
Yeah.
I wanted to hold that. So I discovered spoken word later, discovered Poetry Slam when I was 11 or 12 years old. Shout out. I feel like moms will get a lot of shout outs during this time. My
Yeah.
mom made me participate in my first Poetry Slam, came back to it in high school, and just made that my career. But in terms of the literary poetry stuff, now I'm self-taught. I had one creative writing class in college. It was my worst grade in my major. And it wasn't really until I got to Princeton and sat in Firestone Library and just went through the contemporary poetry section, reading
Mm.
Thaddeus Moss and Terrence Hayes and Tracy K. Smith and sitting with those voices. That's really what helped me become someone that was committed to the page, because before that, for me, it was all sound, right? It was how does the thing sound when you recite it? it only lived on the page when I was first writing it, but every sort of further iteration, it was all up here, and it was based on how it was received by people in a room. So it's been quite the journey.
That's so fascinating. It's one aspect that I think, I wonder if people always, kind of draw this connection, but even though I think in some ways it seems obvious, and in some ways it's very obvious in terms of, our work, actually, all three of us, but that, writing, I think, always is a kind of performance, right? Even when it's on the page, right? That it still has this element of performance, even if we're not quite literally performing it in the way that we think of a more embodied, form of performance, but also that, I think in some ways, I don't know how you guys think about this, but I certainly do. I always feel like I'm trying to find, right, the passageways or the ways that I can connect those realms of performance to each other, right, to kind of get some of that quality of the embodied performance, the grain of the voice to show up on the page, is I feel like something that I'm always trying to figure out how to mess with the words to kind of capture those flavors, capture those qualities. Do you feel that way too?
Yeah, I mean, 100%, because writing's a relationship, right? And I think it's even a relationship between consciousnesses. Often the consciousnesses of people who may never meet or are certainly not in the same room. So for me, whether it was spoken word or, poetry readings, they were ways to make friends, right? And so whenever I'm turning to the page, I want you to feel like you're in the room talking to me, right? Both that kind of that intimacy, that strangeness, and like you're saying, the grain of the voice and the music. To me, if I can't read the poem out loud or even read the prose out loud, and it slaps when it hits the air, if it doesn't, that thing can't get published, man. Like, I'm just not, I don't support that, right? I can't ride for that, because for me, the sonic is always primary. And that's because if people are gathered in a place to hear you, you got to make it worth their time. Right? I've never, I hope I haven't lost that sensibility, right? The idea that we're all here to listen to somebody. So you have to do the thing. And the only way you make space for improvisation, right, is through constant practice. So when I practice on the page, it's trying to get the music right, for whenever I have to share it in front of an audience.
For me, it's more of a bravado thing. So I'm a very anxiety-ridden person. But when I get into my office and I get my groove with my music, like, no one can tell me anything. Well, however long the writing session lasts, is like, excuse my language, I'm the shit for that 30, 45 minutes. And then I'm like, I don't think that was good. But that's the moment. I have to believe in it in that way. And even when the words aren't hitting as a previous session had, I'll say, that's okay. There's a foundation. Like, you're creating something. So that usually where it happens for me psychologically. And then I think, I kind of agree with Joshua, just like in terms of connection with readers. For me, it's like, I'm so interested in creating complex characters and complex situations. Well, you don't necessarily have to agree with me if I'm being the nonfictionist, or you don't have to agree with the characters in my novel. But if you can, like, just ponder for a couple of minutes why they did what they did. I did my job as a storyteller. There are no hard and fast decisions I feel in life. The older I get, I realize how messy situations can be. And that's what I want to make sure that I elucidate on the page.
No, and that comes through. I mean, one thing that can be a challenge, though, right? And Morgan, I think a lot about this in your work, right? Is that, and Josh, you actually alluded to this too, in a way, in terms of talking about needing to create that sense of kind of being in the room, a certain kind of sense of intimacy. But also there's, writing can involve an enormous amount of kind of vulnerability. Even when, you're speaking in, through persona, in the voice of another, in a character, or even to the extent the kind of persona that you become when you're kind of in the voice or the mode of the critic, right? Doing that kind of work. I think in various ways, in differing, very different ways, but to varying degrees, there's also an extraordinary kind of vulnerability that has to be negotiated there. Do you find that to be a challenge?
Yes, more so than when I first started out. I mean,
Mhm.
I remember when I was in college, I was rooming with another aspiring writer, and there were many times, no matter how big or small the situation was, I would always be like, I just wish I didn't feel as much about whatever. I wish I could just let things just roll off me. And
Mhm.
one of my friends, I mean, I'll never forget it. She's like, well, if you were that person, you wouldn't be who you are. You wouldn't be the writer that you are. And
Mhm.
so people who know, when I first started freelancing, before I even had a book deal, sorry for the outside noise, people would always make comments about how honest and vulnerable I am, because like I don't, nobody has time for me to lie to you, you
Mhm.
know. I'm not going to sanitize portions of my life because I'm afraid of backlash, because I'm afraid of whatever. I think I kind of I trust my audience more than that, and I don't want to offend them and make them think that they can't tell on the page when
Mhm.
someone's cutting corners, because my editors can.
Mhm.
So it definitely takes a lot of vulnerability to be a writer. It takes a lot of vulnerability to be like when I wrote Wandering in Strange Lands, when I was writing about the fieldwork that I was doing across Black Americana. There was a lot of times when I wrote in the book, I don't know. I
Mhm.
really don't know. I thought I knew about African American cultures and customs, but I really didn't know. And that was hard for me because my first book was all personal essays. What a lot of people don't realize, like in 2014, in conjunction with Michael Brown's murder, there were a lot of newsrooms that were looking around and trying to figure out like who's going to write about police brutality, who's going to write about Black life, and so that's how I got my start. Aside from writing personal essays, because at that time, personal essays and hot takes were one of the only ways for a person of color or woman of color to break into the industry. So a lot of times around that time that I sold my first book and got the success that it had, a lot of people were downplaying first person confessional. They saw it as a kind of sophomoric. They saw it as being really reduced. And I carried that with me to my second book, Wandering in Strange Lands, where I was writing about Great Migration and family history. And guess what happened? I tried so hard to be this removed, authoritative figure that the draft fell apart multiple times over until I had to sit in my editor's office. And then she realized, she's like, you need to bring that voice back. You need to bring back that intimate voice because you're going on this journey and you're so much more connected to this than you realize. So that's
Mhm.
always been my strongest suit, for better or for worse. It's like, I'm really good at telling a story, but I want it to be very emotionally resonant and I want to take people along with me.
Yeah, and this you're bringing up and touching already on something that well, in part is what inspired this series, right? Which is thinking about the politics of the moment and the relationship in between art making and politics. And I do often feel like we're forced um, into these assumptions and boxes in terms of how politics is supposed to show up
Mm-hmm.
in our work that seem to me always to sort of misunderstand in so many ways the way we actually experience the political, right? Like and in the ways in which it's much more actually kind of imminent, right, to life, to social life, to so that it can come out of rather than addressing it in as if it were a topic, like actually writing about an experience and writing and holding an emotion in a certain kind of key
Mm-hmm.
is itself political, and but whether or not an editor, right, necessarily understands that that's the contribution that's being made, right, or that that's what they're looking for in a certain kind of way,
Mm-hmm.
can be really complicated.
Yeah, I think, because now we're in a fever pitch moment, right? We're in a moment where many of our colleagues, their books are being banned all across the nation because they're being miscategorized as critical race theory. Any type of Black centered perspective is being seen as dangerous. So it's hard not to, Black writers, we have these conversations like, okay, I don't want to make this political, but now we're in a moment where, like, as soon as you speak up and you center your experience, all of a sudden it becomes a politically charged moment. There was something else that you said that kind of like that stuck to me, because it's like, I am thinking about in terms of politics and how to show up as a Black writer. And I was teaching in Germany in the fall of 2019, and I'm at Leipzig University. And one of the first class, I showed my students a clip of from Kathleen Collins. She was a filmmaker, just like a multi-hyphenate woman. And she had a master class at Howard University in 1984. And I think you can even see it on Vimeo. It's public. And she talks about the Christian metaphysic with like, Black people, you're either the saint or the sinner. Historically, there is no normal. It's either push far left or push far right. And me, it's like in the honor of Kathleen Collins and other Black, artists that came before me, I want to be seen as messy. I want to be seen as like, I'm not always the saint. I'm not always the sinner. I'm still figuring it out. I'm unfinalized. I'm an unfinalized self. Shout out to Mikhail Bakhtin. Like that's who I am. And I'm allowed to say, you know what? I made this argument in 2015. I want to go back to that. And maybe I need to correct myself. This idea of evolution is what I constantly push for people to understand, that even if you write something or even if you say something, don't feel like you're in a bind or beholden to someone else's expectations of you, either within your own Black community or outside of it. So that's something I'm always trying to sort of weasel my way out of.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot, Morgan. I mean, you brought up messiness now a couple of times, and I think it really captures what I'm after aesthetically, especially with the way I write about race and masculinity in the poems, right? In particular, the ways that Black men sort of do and imagine gender that are not available to the discourse of the contemporary academy, at least it seems to me, right? So part of what I'm really trying to get at, and what you're talking about, Jesse, was sort of holding this moment without giving it over to the contemporary discourse, right? And whatever terms it has available, is just thinking about what actually happens in a barbershop, for instance, right? Or a bunch of 11-year-old Black boys wearing ankle weights because we all want 40-inch verticals. It's not clear to me that the language I learned in graduate school helps me talk about that at all. And it took me until I was 32 years old to realize I don't need it, right? That we had that language back then in those spaces. And coming back to that in the writing has been so life affirming for me, just to say, well, we already had all the vocabulary we needed on the block for what we were doing. We knew what we were doing, right? We named it, we claimed it. And reducing that distance, I think, has been so productive in terms of bringing the charge back to the language of the work.
And I also just want to make it clear to audience members, when I mean messiness, I don't mean some type of hastily put together piece of art. Like what I mean by that is like what Josh said, you could be in a barbershop and hear the most wretched conversations at a certain point, but then you might have that same barber who, yeah, you don't agree with them, but that person always made sure you looked good for wherever you went. That person always looked out for you, and that person might be able to, influence you in other ways. And I think it's so important for us as writers who go in and out of these spaces, academia, barbershops, church, and all that, to realize that like what we're doing is we're sifting through all of that, through language, through our experiences. And oftentimes I feel like the brilliance comes through the contradiction, where you're like in one single moment or one single episode that you have, where you can hold these two thoughts together, and you don't really understand like how you're going to relate on the page, because you have outside who doesn't exist in your body, and you're trying to make it make sense, even if it's irresolute. That's something that I think I'm learning even as I'm interviewing, or people interview me, I'm noticing, I'm saying this, I'm like, it's also, I'm contradicting myself, but that doesn't mean that I'm unintelligent. That doesn't mean that I'm like playing to a bit. You know what I mean? I'm working towards ...
I'm thinking now also, about, I was just teaching earlier, I was teaching John Keene's book, Annotations. It's a great little book from 1995. And actually he has a brand new book of poetry that I have not had a chance to get my hands on. I believe it's called Punk. Is it called Punk?
Punks, yeah.
Punks, thank you, Josh. Shout out to John Keene. I'm very excited to read that book as soon as I can get my hands on it. But he has a beautiful line in there where he talks about the kind of boundless and kind of endless kind of sources and resources of poetry in our own lives, right? And all of the ways in which, I think the poetic and the word surges out of the social, right? And we've been talking about those spaces, and this got me to thinking, there's a kind of traditional, book conversation question that people have about like influence, right? Where it's about like naming the earlier authors, the whole Ellisonian thing about ancestors and so on and so forth, literary ancestors versus elders and so on and so forth. But it got me to thinking about, how in a certain kind of way that's maybe inadequate to the way we ought to talk about literary influence as including, at least as importantly, or maybe in some cases even more importantly, right, like sources and lines of influence that are not themselves traditionally considered literary, right? So I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about like sources of influence for you in your work that you think of, and they could be on either level, right? The literary, the non-literary, both.
Yeah, for sure. Dipset is probably the first that comes to mind. Just like Jadakiss. I mean, I'm from Yonkers, right? So Jadakiss, DMX, Styles P, Mary J. Blige, that entire sort of segment of the Black expressive tradition coming out of YO, the Baptist and Pentecostal preachers of my youth, of course. And then, I mean, we've already talked about spoken word poets. So Saul Williams, someone like Sonny Patterson. I mean, the people I was seeing on Def Poetry Jam, but also in poetry slams around the country, these were the folks who taught me about what it meant to take a truly democratic approach to language, right? The idea that this same 3-minute poem should make a venue go up in Atlanta and in the South Bronx, right? And in Miami. Like, I need to be able to travel with this work. And what it meant that every time I went into the lab, I needed to have that sensibility was tremendously helpful. From Jada, if you all have seen the Versus competitions, he treats the thing like a sport. I mean, Jadakiss doesn't have to be in your top 5, but if you have a Versus top 5, Jada needs to be top 2 and not 2, right? Because the brother seemingly can't lose in that space. And I love that energy that he brings to everything. And that taught me something about what it meant to every time I approach sort of the blank page or the blank screen, to think about it as a competition with myself, right? To go back and forth, not to dominate the older voice, but to spar with it, right? And again, not have to lose the messiness of that sensibility. You asked about vulnerability earlier, and it's always a word I struggle with because I think about being vulnerable to various forms of physical violence as a younger person, right? As like a kid on the block and in school, where it was frankly terrifying. But how did you navigate that? Friends, some friends who were bigger than you, right? My big brother teaching me how to do push-ups and my big sister teaching me how to fight. And that was a social affair, right? Being able to defend oneself, having to rework that relationship through language, right? To say, well, actually, maybe I can open myself up again. And all of the language doesn't have to be defensive, which of course is what you learn in graduate school, right? You get all the language needed to build up an argument through which no one can ever touch you, right? And feel human flesh. Having to relinquish that armor to come to the poetry, I got that from musicians. I got that from Sam Cooke, right? I got that from Smokey Norfolk and Smokey Robinson. Like that's where that sensibility came back to me. And I'm incredibly thankful for it, because I think without it, I would have been torn asunder. If it was just me in the books.
Yeah.
At various times, didn't have all the resources I needed, right? I had to go to a deeper, more ancient place to find sustenance.
Beautiful.
Love that ancient place. Like I said, I'm a really nosy person. I could be, especially in New York, when I used to live in New York, I could be on a subway, and right before the song on my MP3 player goes from one song to the next, and that little time in between, I can hear a conversation, and I'll be like, man, that's wild. Whatever they're talking about, I don't agree with that. But when it lingers in my head for longer than when I go to wherever I need to go to, I'm like, there might be something there, especially the stuff I don't usually agree with. When I can't immediately react to something and I keep thinking about it, I'm like, that might be something to explore artistically. Maybe I have a hard and fast rule for that. I mean, music wise, I mean, Black Thought, his 10-minute freestyle, like I'm still thinking about it because I'm like, how do you just have continuous flow for that long? I don't know. Even when I write, I don't know if I've ever written for 10 minutes straight.
Yeah.
Like there's always a stop in between. So that's why I was like,
Mhm.
how does someone do that? And pulling all these different
Breath control.
references. Like, I don't really
Mhm.
understand how people do that. Something music-wise that I'm still trying to explain is like, over the pandemic, I've been listening to a lot of retro wave and vaporwave. Any of you know what that is? It's basically like if you take 80s type soundtracks or 80s type vibes, but they were released in 2010, or like 90s aesthetics, and people are recreating it. And I've been wondering, like, why am I listening to this stuff during the pandemic, especially in March 2020? And I read an essay from someone about it in like this indie magazine, and someone was saying it's like you're thinking about the world that could have been before perhaps global laws, before 9/11, before the hysteria of the Y2K bug, all these different things. And so I have really been meditating on like time being disrupted, thinking about it now in the pandemic of what could have happened, what could have been better, how we could have better dealt with it in March 2020. Also thinking about it in terms of as a Black person, because I got an email from someone that had read my books, Haitian woman in Brooklyn, and she called me a conjurer. And when she said that, I was like, what do you mean? She's like, because you keep bringing up the people that come before you in your work, and you're kind of realigning them alongside the present day. So I'm definitely figuring out how time can be disrupted, or time, you know, can be altered in terms of the way that I'm speaking about it language wise when I'm on the page. And music definitely is helping with that, because nostalgia could be a trap, but I feel like nostalgia can also illuminate certain, like Joshua said, ancient parts of ourselves that we're still trying to sift through.
Wow. That, yeah, that makes me, I'm thinking about how, and I hadn't thought about this until now, but that some of the disruptions that we've been going through might generate certain kinds of yearnings and or so what we might think of initially as nostalgia, but are actually better thought of as yearnings for lost worlds in a certain sense, not in the past, but as sort of lost options kind of the future that it seemed to have been kind of stolen from us, and kind of taken away. And, this has me thinking a little bit about, I mean, obviously, there's one way in which I think a lot of writing, especially obviously, of course, the lyric, but also in other forms, can do a kind of praise work. But there's also the work of mourning, right? And the work of elegy, which can be very, very immediate and intimate and personal and concrete, right? For very specific people in our lives. But there are many things to mourn, right? And many ways, of course, to mourn. And I'm wondering if that's maybe also part of this, that our writing and our literature in this moment is also kind of looking for new ways to articulate elegy and mourning in a moment when we feel like so many things are being taken away, quite literally taken away, and also as kind of options or visions for the future, paths not taken in a certain kind of way.
I love that phrase, lost options for the future. Oh, that's like, it feels like a dystopian, but also like optimistic way to look forward. I think not just elegy and mourning, but I'm trying to live beyond my physical body.
Yeah.
That's a lot of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to exist beyond. And I understand that when I write certain books, I was in a moment for a particular time, but I feel like that's what writing is, writing that lives on. I mean, even when someone brings up Toni Morrison on Twitter, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's not Earthside anymore, because everybody keeps calling her name. They keep calling her name, and they keep giving her flowers. And so, I mean, you look behind me, you can't even see the lighting's bad, but Josephine Baker's behind me. You know what I mean? And I look up to her so much, and still what she does, it feels really fresh to me. So I think it's a part of loss. It's a part of imagining and reimagining, also to exist beyond ourselves, because if you believe in ancestral veneration, they're always with you anyway. And that's what I realized when I was doing field work, particularly in the low country of Georgia and South Carolina, which is very, very mystical. It was very transformative for me, where I was going to all these places by myself. The people I was talking to were wondering, like, what's this, this girl doing by herself? And a lot of times, I felt like I was being watched over. I didn't have that same experience while I was writing This Will Be My Doing. It was very, very just me, the self, oftentimes in certain parts claustrophobic. And when I started expanding and thinking of people that live in the same era that I live in, but also people that came before me that are informing my work, that's when it started to feel like, speak about them in the present, speak about them because they are here. And so that's also what I think about when I'm writing now, to be more in alignment in that way.
Yeah, I mean, so my grandmother, Charlotte Elizabeth Ballard, may she rest, she passed at the top of the pandemic. And we had to go to her funeral via Zoom, right? And the writing was one of the only ways it could even feel like I had any proximity to her after that, sort of thinking about what it meant that was happening in the same window of time that my son, who's now across the hall from me, was coming into the world, right? It put an entirely new lens on that, sort of classic Baldwin line about why he's not a pessimist, right? For who will tell the children there is no hope. And the immediacy of that sort of just struck me in a different way. I realized that I had to have an immediate vision of the future that was not just hopeful, but practically sound, right? I had to think in very different ways about it, what it meant to try to build an infrastructure for this small human being's life, using the lessons I got from that woman, right? Which largely had to do with music, with Black folk tales, and with poetry. The second thing I'll say on this, just on the poetry front, this is a moment of profound literary stewardship, right? So we've already talked a little bit. I mentioned Tracy K. Smith and Terrence earlier. I had an event with Tracy last week where she was talking about Lucille Clifton's memoir, Generations, right? Arceli Skirme just re-released a selected poems of Clifton, Terrence Hayes, Wanda Coleman, and Christopher Gilbert, Turning into Dwelling, which I have right here.
Yes.
Gilbert, brilliant, but I never heard of his work before Terrence wrote an essay sort of reintroducing him, and then this collection of poems. So I think we're also living in a moment where Black poets in particular are saying, now we need to go back and recover some work from the ancestors, even, ancestors we have who just died 10, 20, 30 years ago. Like, that stuff has been completely forgotten, even though it's absolutely necessary, right? Their contributions are timely and vivid and vibrant. And so that's been on my mind too, when I go to think about the poems, is who do we need to recover, and how do we pay attention, to those voices who've been suppressed or rendered largely invisible.
Yeah. And I think, it's one of the things that I do think, for what it's worth, the literary somehow does have this particular kind of connecting work that it does, right? Across temporalities. It's the way in which it's always, you open the book or you begin the poem and you're in the present, but you're also somehow already calling up voices past and times past that show up in the present, sort of, on top of it or glued to it in that moment. And I have always thought of that as one of the extraordinary kind of powers that the word really has. And I'm saying the present and the past. There is, of course, also the future, and the imagination as it projects forward. That said, there is a feeling, I think, these days that there's an enormous amount of despair in the world. We're still, trapped in this terrible pandemic. We've come through so much trauma and so much loss. There's so many kind of catastrophes that feel like they're looming over us, that feel beyond the scope of our fixing, even with our best efforts. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on, corners of the world of culture and expression, literary or frankly otherwise, that sort of that are inspiring you right now, that give you hope, that you're kind of turning to as a kind of source of inspiration in your own work, or that you're thinking alongside with at this time?
B.B. King's 1973 Thanksgiving concert in Sing Sing prison.
Wow.
It's something I've been thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
The moment where he sings, he says, somebody loves you, guess who? Right. And he's just talking about like what it meant to be there with those folks in that space. And I think part of course, right, what's fallen out of our discourse on the pandemic is how it absolutely ravaged, right, our jails and prisons in this country, right? In this moment, we incarcerate more human beings than any nation on earth. So I've been thinking a lot about the tenderness, the joy, and even just the beautiful instrumentation of that concert, which you can find on YouTube. So I've been thinking about that. And honestly, I've been thinking about Medicine for Melancholy, the Barry Jenkins film.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Even though it's not a hopeful movie, but it was the first piece of art from him that I ever encountered. And it was my favorite film in college. And coming back to that, I've just been thinking about his patience, right? To riff on Kevin Quashie, with the kind of quieter tones of Black life.
Yeah, it is.
Right. And that not everything has to be an explosion, right? Or a detonation. There's something to just sitting with those sort of more muted tones of Black people falling in love or not falling in love, or just spending time with one another, getting lost in the rhythms of a dimly lit dance hall. Trying to recapture those textures and tones, I think, has been a kind of beautiful, life-affirming, even calming writing practice for me recently, is to think about, okay, well, how do I pursue that? Not just the kind of explosive punchline, but how do I sit with these quieter, softer textures and tones and say, Black life is lived here too. Now let's train our ear to hear it.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Music wise, I love Ella Fitzgerald. Like, I love Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong. It makes me feel really happy. I listen to it. Movie wise, I'm a huge fan of Sean Baker. He's a white filmmaker, but he made this movie called Tangerine that focused on Black trans women.
Oh.
And I love, and it doesn't happen often, but I love when I watch a movie, I'm like, oh, just put this on. And just transfixed, because there's so much in the media about the murder of Black trans women, how it is a huge problem, and it is. But in spite of incarceration, in spite of that persisting threat of violence, he was able to capture in like a tight 90, 80, 100 minutes, friendship and survival across Los Angeles. And I keep thinking about it because it's like, we can speak so much to the horrors or what's terrifying about existing as a Black person, but let's not also forget the laughter, the banter, the cadences of our conversations, and how they can fill up the space too, even if you have that specter of what could happen. I think about that also with, I just watched a new series called Reservation Dogs. It's about these indigenous kids that live in Oklahoma, and they're trying to make their way to California after a tragedy with one of their friends. And same thing. It was the first time I saw a full indigenous cast in television. And even though, like, if you're mindful of certain problems that can plague indigenous communities and reservations, you still have these kids that are so together with each other. They honor their rituals. They honor their ancestors. They don't always have to explain the words that they use. We just have to figure it out as an audience of context clues. And it really influenced me, because I feel like sometimes we have to have like a white translator and have to like pass it through what I'm trying to say. And it gave me hope that, you know what? I don't need to explain that. You got context clues. You know what I mean? You can figure out, you can still pick it up, what's going on. So those are the things that's really been inspiring me lately.
We're at 7:20 somehow already. I don't know how this always happens to me, that we run through the time so quickly. I do see in a question. There's a question here from Larnell about about activism. Activism, how do you connect your writing with your activism, and how do you see activism as an art, actually? Either of you want to take that up?
Well, I just want to say I'm actually not an activist, and I try to make it really clear, because when I
Yeah.
started writing about Black Lives Matter, police brutality, people used to like to style me as a writing activist, and I'm not. So I'm not an organizer. I have been, attended a march and whatnot, but I'm not an activist. But I will say, in terms of my politics, they have, since I started writing professionally in 2014, have gone so far left, thank God. So I try to make it clear when I write things, and also when I'm speaking to people about structural inequalities, to put it in that particular context. How do I, and so in terms of, so I can't really speak to the other question, but I just wanted to make that clear of mine.
No, yeah, I think that matters, right? It's important to draw those distinctions too.
And I think too, part of what I hope I'm doing is using the art to point to people who are organizers and artists themselves, people like Derricka Purnell and Mariam Kaba, for instance, right? Two of our more prominent abolitionist thinkers in the moment. Because I'm not an organizer. That's a very specific calling that has very specific stakes and demands something very specific from your life, right? And so, but I am an educator and I'm an artist. So part of what I've been trying to think about more, though, is how to use even the art practice as a way to enact the politics. So trying to collaborate, for example, with writers on the inside, people like Justin Rovios Monson, who I think is just one of the most gifted living poets we have. Trying to collaborate with folks like Justin and just think about ways to kind of break down the physical and other sort of institutional barriers that exist between people on the outside and inside, especially as it pertains to the sharing of writing and the dissemination of writing that's happening in our nation's jails and prisons.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think, the only other thing that I sometimes say when I get that question is that I think, for me, even if it may be and it is in fact limited in various ways, I think of teaching as a genuinely important and ethical act, right? That's not necessarily always viewed, and isn't necessarily always would be correctly kind of classified as a kind of activism, but it's about shaping, right? It's about shaping and forming and giving opportunity to others. And I think that you can bring, I think you have to bring, right, a certain kind of ethics to that. And so I do think of teaching as one way, at least, that, I think of my work as connected to activism. If not, I wouldn't necessarily classify it as activism in and of itself. But do we have any other questions?
There's one from April.
Oh yeah, okay, so where's the question here?
Chat box, I can read it if you want me to.
Go ahead.
James Baldwin famously said, "The price one pays for pursuing any profession or calling is an intimate knowledge of its ugly side."
Oh, wow.
Do you believe, I'm ready. I am ready. I saw this like 10 minutes ago. Do you believe there to be an ugly side about the published life of being a Black writer? Yes. Yes. I'm tired of repeating myself. Every time, every year, when there's the New York Times, or I forget which other publication is, where they give the statistics of how white publishing is. And we have these cyclical conversations about, where are the Black and brown people in publishing? Well, when I was at Princeton, they told me straight up that you have to do unpaid internships in order to get into the publishing industry. So imagine how many people are eliminated just off that alone. Thankfully, I always tell people about my privilege. I had no student loans from Princeton. My late stepfather was a veteran, and because of a benefit program, I didn't have to take any loans for when I went to Bennington for my MFA. So that's why I was able to come to New York and sleep on my friend's couch to be able to get into the industry. But how are you going to get more diversity and sustainability, and higher retention rates if you're only paying people $30,000-$35,000 in New York City? So I hate the fact that every time this stuff comes around yearly, I always have to repeat myself. The other thing that I think is ugly, the ugly side about the publishing life of being a Black writer is being more mindful of people who don't make it. And being and trying to explain to people that there are all these different levels to go through. It's not just enough to have an agent. They have to know people to pitch your book to. And then when you have the editor, depending on if they're just a junior editor or associate editor, then they have to be in acquisition meetings and talk about them. Then they have to fight in terms of the payment that you get. So trying to explain that to people and realizing, like the year my book came out, this will be mine doing, I think only 16% of authors that either are published or Black. And I think that is just realizing that there's, once you get in, it ain't just in, there's still all these different levels that you didn't even see. I think that's the ugly side of publishing. And I don't know if this is ugly. This might be to the messy part of it. It's like the conversations that they were having during the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, we having them now, 100 years later. How do we represent Black life accurately? Who gets to represent a certain swath of Black life who gets the opportunity to represent a certain swath of Black life? What type of milieu do they occupy professionally? And so I think that those are the things that I have to keep talking about when I'm in conversation with people. Yes, I understand I'm a Black woman, but understand I am not as susceptible to these type of structural violences as these other people are. Making it very clear when I say that to white audiences, because a lot of times when you talk about being a Black person and your Black experiences specifically, because they don't have another reference point of other Black people in their life, they just take your word as bond and to just cover that for every single Black person that they see.
Yeah.
The last part I'll say is on the flip side, a lot of times you realize, like, I want to write about me. I want to write about my specific experiences. You can also come up against people who are like, well, why didn't you represent me in your work? And I'm talking about within my own community, Black community. And I realized, even though that's frustrating for me to kind of forge my own path, I also realized that demonstrates the inequality. So many of us don't make it. So many of us don't get the opportunity. So what are we going to do with it? So yeah, I'm done.
I'll just mention a couple of things quickly. I mean, this is more on sort of the media representation side outside of publishing. So I was in a TV pitch meeting about a year ago, pitching a project, an adaptation of a book I have coming out in a couple of months, and was told by a TV executive that they were not in the Black utopia business. So I tell that story for a couple of different reasons. One, it's an astonishing line, but also because I think it's tied to a larger issue in terms of younger Black writers, right? I think a number of us are approached. I mean, this happened to me in the summer of 2020, right? During this sort of international uprising around anti-Black violence at the hands of state actors. All people wanted me to write about, though, when I was being published, or rather approached by these magazines to publish, was Black people dying, right? They were like, well, why don't you just talk to us about that, right? Talk to us about the corpses. And it seems to me that has become, and I'm riffing here on Morgan too. I mean, it seems like it's one of the only ways they'll kind of let you in, right, to those spaces. Is like, you have to write about Black death, right? Black social death, Black civic death, literal sort of biological Black death. That's the only thing we really want to hear about from you. And even if you try to take maybe a different perspective on it, they'll then say, well, your voice can't be too academic, right? The prose can't be too dense. It needs to be written, with the idea of a capacious range of readers. And so that sort of strange puppetry is something I was completely unfamiliar with when I was just doing YouTube videos, or just writing, prose for academic articles. The idea that the only way I could enter in that space of other public Black voices was just to talk about my people suffering and the various sorts of violences and violations they faced every day. That was truly harrowing for me. You've known me for a long time, Jesse. That blew me away as an idea, that was sort of all we wanted to hear. It's all they wanted to hear from me. And so I think that's one of the ugly sides of publishing that many of us just sort of know, right? Like that's where you're seeing Black people represented most often, right? Is in a space of being made to mourn publicly over and over and over again, often in the same way. And so what I hope, I think for my cohort and for the generation coming up after us, as just to find new and ever more creative ways to represent a wide and expansive and untamed spectrum of Black life, right? Of Black sociality and Black imagination. I want us to have Black institutions that, frankly, have enough space and enough funding to be able to bankroll those sorts of projects so folks can feed themselves, right? Quite literally, like food and drink, so people can make livings and support their families and support themselves. And yeah, I mean, that's the ugly side, but the bright side, if I may, just sort of throw that in there at the end, is that I see it being built. I see it being built through sort of Cave Canem and the Hurston Wright Foundation. I see it being built in the conversations like the ones we're having here, and also amongst my peers, even in the sciences, like people just having different sorts of conversations about what it means to build not just sort of material Black wealth, but Black wealth in the way Nikki Giovanni says it, right? Which is Black love, how to build sort of material basis for Black love to flourish. And I am also seeing that everywhere. That to me, I think, is the persistent, shimmering thread, not just that we will survive, but that we'll take care of one another.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said. And, just to say a little something on this, I know we're coming up on time, but, I think a lot about this in part through what Saidiya Hartman has taught us, right? About the ways in which, Black suffering and whether it's through images, through representations in various ways of, the violation of the Black body and its display can function, as she puts it, as a sentimental resource, right? And when I think about that, right, and the extraction and of that resource and its insertion into a marketplace, which is what the publishing industry in part, is, right? It's part of the larger marketplace, but it's part of the marketplace that controls a significant portion of our culture, right? It's really interested in ultimately capitalizing, right, making a profit, but it's also operating within certain logics of attention, right, of the economy of attention. And so you're always, it's this really strange and sometimes very violent experience of being slotted and called upon to fulfill the aims of this economy of attention at a particular moment, which rise and ebb and flow according to whether or not it seems to be sort of profitable at that particular moment to draw upon you or to use you essentially to kind of gain a certain amount of profit in that particular instance. And that makes me think in a way, just to wrap this up, about the ways in which the literary, one of its strengths, I think, is precisely that it has a very different understanding of attention, right? And that it can pay attention and draw our attention to things that the market logic does not, right? That the market logic would not draw your attention to, does not pay attention to, does not care about. And I think in both of your works, there's an extraordinary quality of attention, right? And a drawing of our attention to aspects of Black life that otherwise, that the market is not ever going to necessarily, right, take an interest in, right, and hold. Josh, even I was thinking about how you're saying earlier, medicine for melancholy, even, the quiet moments, the moments that, we all know and are also familiar with, but are so rarely, seen as kind of valuable in and of themselves, right, and available for certain kinds of representation. And I do think that, the literary work that you guys are practicing really has this extraordinary quality of rerouting us back to those sites of ourselves, of our social lives, of our experience, aesthetic experience, and social experience that's inherently valuable, right, and inherently beautiful. And so I want to thank you both, really, for the blessings of this conversation. It's really been a wonderful, wonderful time, and thank you for your work, for all the work that you've already done, and all the work that's coming. And you're both still really in this extraordinary phase in your careers where we know there's so much more to come. And it's just very, very exciting to watch it be produced. And we'll all be looking out for more of it as it comes out. So thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking to you both tonight.
Yeah, it's an honor and a pleasure. And Jesse, don't play. We know you got more books on the way.
I
You
know.
already had a banner
I'm
here.
cooking.
Two of them
Yeah,
guns.
I know.
More coming.
I just want to echo Jesse's thanks. I mean, what generous sharing you all did for us tonight about art and your perspectives and roles and expectations. And there's so much to think about. I really don't even know where to begin to think about what you've just said. So we're honored and proud at the Brooklyn Public Library Center for Brooklyn History to have played a role in this, making this conversation exist. And I want to let everybody out there know that it's been recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube page tomorrow. And by the way, the other two programs in this series are also on the YouTube page, and they're wonderful and rich and deep. And I hope that everyone explores some of the other upcoming programs that we have at CBH and at Brooklyn Public Library. I hope you sign up for 370J Project's great emails. And I hope that we'll have reasons to invite all of you back for more of this incredible conversation. It feels too short. So thank you. Thanks to everybody. Everybody have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.